By now, Rubin Carter has been locked up for 13 years, telling court after court he is not a murderer. At the same time, here in Bushwick, a 15-year-old boy, Lesra Martin, meets a group of Canadians from Toronto who will change the course of his life forever. And together, they will change the life of Rubin Hurricane Carter.
Carter and Artis were found guilty of gunning down 3 people, triple murder in a bar.
Carter said he and Artis did not, would not, and could not commit the crime of triple murder for which they have been found guilty.
This is the Hurricane Tapes, a 13-part series based on the discovery of candid cassettes that Rubin made before he died. These tapes reveal a dark anti-hero, a self-confessed monster.
Nobody wanted my findings to come out.
Rubin Carter and John Artis are the only 2 men ever to have been charged with this crime. Solving it is something that cops, investigators, journalists, they all gave up on doing that years ago. But we've spent more than a year investigating the case, speaking to almost everyone involved. So did Rubin Carter and John Artis shoot and kill 3 people at the Lafayette Bar and Grill on June 17, 1966? Well, the Hurricane Tapes tells the story, and it might just solve the case.
Right, the process is back, and this is a different kind of the process. I've spoken to different people who've kind of spoken about their lives, but for this one, what I'm really struck by is the process of how you've made a podcast that I was just enthralled by, and just blown away with the kind of commitment that you needed to show to make it. Now I'm going to get this line out very quickly because it's on my mind, and I imagine certainly you, Steve, wanted to say it a million times. This is the story of the hurricane, okay? Rubin Hurricane Carter was a boxer, and he was imprisoned alongside
John Artis,
of course. Twice.
Yeah.
And it's just an incredible story, and a lot of people will know the Bob Dylan song, but they'll also know the film, The Hurricane with Denzel Washington, and you two guys. So you're a producer, Joel, aren't you?
I am. I'm a producer,
and specifically with the World Service at the BBC and audio.
So we both worked for BBC World Service at the time, and I concentrated on longer form programming. So and documentary making, but it wasn't really sport. So like stories that were very loosely connected to sport,
yes,
but actually were really about people and events and stuff
sometimes
like that.
Incredibly loosely connected.
Sometimes, yeah, I mean, you had to crowbar things in.
The guy the footballer who made one of those beer hats that you can drink out of.
Wow.
These were amongst his pre-Hurricane Tapes highlights.
Your
Max. Somebody
CV's been given a little boost by this.
Yeah, well, no, I don't know. I was award-winning before the Hurricane. But I mean, so this was perfectly set up for the kind of things that I like to do. But I wish I could take credit for thinking it's time to tell this story again. But annoyingly, that is his.
There we go.
Yeah. So the way this started was, I was in the car on the way to the Lake District with my then girlfriend. And this actually just kind of explains how long this process has taken. I had a girlfriend, and now I have a wife.
Right.
Now you're divorced.
It's the same girl. And we were in the car going to the Lake District, and the Bob Dylan song came on, and I was like, oh, love this, know all the words.
Yes.
She had no idea why I knew all the words, and then I was like, because you've seen the film, nothing. So we watched the film together, and then I was like, 1967 Conviction. It's exactly 50 years ago. So this is 2017. We were getting into it, and I started thinking, we'll make something about the 50th anniversary of this wrongful conviction, and it'll be an hour documentary. But then, like, once we started chipping away at it, I realised very quickly, I was like, there is so much more to this. So that's where I recruited Joel.
Yeah.
Well, that's it for me. So again, a bit more context for you guys. So the guys put together the Hurricane Tapes, which was a podcast series about Rubin Carter, and what you won't know until you start listening to it. And I want to be careful here in terms of, I want to talk about some of the themes of the series, but I don't want to give it away.
So
really.
no spoilers.
No, total
He was convicted.
Spoilers. Yes, he was convicted. We can say that. Twice, we can say that. But listening to it, what I was amazed by was how much time you had to put into this. We were chatting just before we started. 2017 this started. So how long was the whole process between having an idea to do it and it going out?
So I came up with the idea in August, and then I got you on board in the September. So August 2017, and the series finished in April 2019.
Yeah.
Right.
So 18 months
year and a half,
so.
roughly,
Yeah. Basically a year and a half.
And so with that in mind, when did you know that, oh, this is bigger than I thought? Or did you look at it and
when
go...
you wanted to talk to us.
Right,
we knew we'd made it.
now.
We knew we'd made it.
No, but when did you realise that, wow, this isn't just a story that we can tell, this is something that we can investigate? Because you did.
It was the tapes, wasn't it?
I don't know. I think for me, it wasn't. It was before that, actually. So I got to say, again, it's really annoying, but Steve had done a lot of work in that month before he'd come to me. So it's not like he comes to me and said to me, oh, I've got this really good idea, but I don't know how to do it. Only you can help me. He was like, I've already organised interviews with John Artis and the judge and this one and that one. And so I was like, okay, this is great. This is a no-brainer for me because the hard work has already been done.
Right.
And this will be,
you know, free flights.
a couple of
America,
weeks in America and a week off the rota. Jobs are good, and that's 3 weeks. Don't have to worry about.
2 years later.
And whilst I'm there, there's this guy who makes these beer cans.
yeah, exactly. I'm sure I can find another story like that. No, so but our very first interview. Remember who our first interview was?
Our first interview was Tom Kidron
Almost.
or Jim Hirsch.
It was Losey.
Right.
So basically, we'd gathered a very, very large list of people that we were already due to go and see, and they were all of the same opinion that Carter had this terrible injustice done to him, and that was fine because that was the story as we understood it, as Dylan sang it, as Washington portrayed it. Yeah. And then we realised that there was another side to this. There was a group of people, and it was because of the film, wasn't it? Yeah. Because Washington was up for an Oscar, and basically he didn't get the Oscar because this protest group campaigned against him. Not against him per se, but
the idea that he was innocent.
Yeah, the idea that he was telling this story in Hollywood that this guy was completely innocent. And so we started looking a little bit more closely at the idea that the story as told in the film, or by nearly everyone who's come to look at this case, that there was another side. And I think, if I'm completely honest, we got in touch with more people who were of the opinion that Carter was involved or he was guilty. Right. And I really wanted them to be nutcases.
Yeah. Well, so that was one thing I was desperate to ask you. I'll ask you now then. How difficult is it to be, and this whole case, and a lot of the conversation I want to have with you is about being biased, about being certain about something and maybe not being right about that, about the justice system and how that plays a part in all of it. How difficult was it to stay neutral and not become biased yourselves when making and looking into this incredible subject that so many people looked at?
It was very difficult, but actually it was not difficult because of Rubin Carter, it was difficult because of John Artis.
Right.
Because it's very difficult to separate the two men.
So just to give people a bit of background on that, tell us about John Artis.
Okay, so John Artis was convicted alongside Rubin Carter of the murders. And without giving too much away about the series, it's definitely fair to say that on the night of the murders, around the time of the murders, it's pretty much impossible to separate them. So essentially, if you believe John Artis is innocent, then you really have to believe Rubin Carter is innocent and vice versa. Right. Now, to be honest, from day one, we learn some really disturbing things about Rubin Carter, and he is the guy who's been made out to be this, absolutely wronged hero. But his actual character, he was a pretty horrific human being in his early years.
Yes.
He's a guy who was rightly put behind bars more than once. He's a guy who, one of the crimes he committed was like mugging an old woman. He did some pretty horrific stuff. John Artis is absolutely the opposite of that. Just a lovely kid growing up, high school track star. Wouldn't say boo to a goose.
And did you feel that when you then met him?
Oh,
because
definitely.
he's still alive, so he's in all these.
We did a really long interview with John because he's so engaging. Now, obviously, his story is compelling, but he's so engaging and pleasant. And afterwards, I think we both looked at each other once John had left, and we were like, "Well, there's no way he did that. There's no way that man put 5 bullets into a woman from close range. There's just no way." And that did make it a bit of a challenge. But I think the interesting part is that we met so many people on this journey who had taken a position one way or the other, and they were incapable and unwilling to countenance anything that didn't fit with what they thought. And so actually it became really important to both of us that we didn't have a sacred cow, that we didn't have a position that we were defending, that we were open to understanding anything, whether it fitted with what we wanted to think or not.
So would you two talk about it? Would you just leave your cow to the side? If you know what I mean?
Literally, we barely talk about anything else. We were constantly in conversation of what do we think happened here, and our opinions changed dramatically back and forth during the course of the series, which I think you can probably hear in the series. It's that thing of like, I have one side of journalism that I have a very strong view on is, if you have an idea of a story and go out and you do that story, even if it becomes in the face of things that you're learning, then you're not doing yourself justice as a journalist. If the goalposts change as you go along, you've got to go with them. And I think that's one of the things I enjoyed most about making this, is you can tell as we go through the series, we're not starting with a point of view. It's not like episode 1 begins with a tease of what happens in episode 13, because when episode 1 was made, we haven't even done anything for it. When episode 9 was made, we haven't done anything for the last few episodes. So we meandered all over the shop.
So from a lot of people, so this will go on YouTube. The series called The Process. So I wanted to touch on also, just as two guys who make stuff. What was your process in terms of how we're going to tell this story? Was it as simple as, is it research, then interviews, then piecing it together? Because what I find amazing is, what I love the storytelling of this whole thing, the commitment to the storytelling from both of you, and then doing that not in a visual medium, but bringing it to life via a podcast. And I'm saying a lot here, but what was your process of putting together this whole thing then? What was, because I think you do have that blank page, don't you?
Well, I think we've both got a background in radio, so for us to put together something in radio and bring it to life is what we do every day. So that we did.
So it felt natural.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
I think that one way to explain that, and it was something that was mentioned to us early in the process of doing this, is to adopt like a bit of a New York Times style. And what I mean by that is, it's the idea that, and one of my mates works at the New York Times, so somebody said to us, make it like the New York Times, and we went, of course we'll do that. And then we left the meeting, we were like, what does that mean? And I spoke to my mate, and he gave me a great...
on your accent.
Yeah, exactly. He gave me a great answer. He was like, this is Rory Smith from the New York Times, who's a very, very good football writer. Yes. And he said, you take one small aspect and you grow it from there. So if you read anything in the New York Times, and it's true of more modern publications now, like The Athletic as well, quite often it starts with a tiny little detail, and the detail can be anything, but it's always a bit of colour. Like if it's about a football transfer, it doesn't start with Philippe Coutinho signed for Bayern Munich. It starts with something like, it's something to do with his blooming hand luggage or something on his flight over. It's a tiny detail that you expand out from, and that's something that I thought about a lot when it came to doing links. It's that idea of one little thing, one piece of detail that you can see before you grow.
Because that's what I took from it as well. Listening to it, there are moments where, and I think I was trying to simplify it actually, but it was things like it was emotions and senses.
Yeah.
And you know the some of the interview, I think the interview with John Artist, that you can hear seagulls, or there's another interview with someone else where you're eating and it's almost an excuse to go, don't worry, sorry about the sound quality because someone's going to be eating, but it takes you there. Yeah, and that's an amazing thing about podcasts and radio, isn't it?
No, you have to. I mean, the truth is that it lives or dies by being able to take someone to not only a place but a time, and that's where the music came in. You know, everything had been chosen for a very specific reason, and that is to try and transport you from wherever you are listening to this to 1966 Paterson, New Jersey, or 2017 Paterson, New Jersey, or wherever it is that we're going. Everything has to be focused at, because you don't have obviously visual ability to throw things in. Archive was really important. You know, there's nothing like hearing a bit of original archive that just takes you right there. So, but the process itself was really different from anything we had done before. We obviously had never done anything over such a long period of time. Something that was new to me. I work in audio, so if I edit something, I do a long interview, I will listen to it and I will edit it as I go along. Here, we had things transcribed and we picked out and then edited off the back of what we wanted, which I know sounds very technical and geeky. I'd never done that before, and it was a bit of a revelation because it enabled me to piece the story together in a much more fluent way. And yeah, I think the scripting, like, I'd never taken so much time. Like, we poured over. The
scripts that we wrote, we worked it out at the end, was like, it would, if you put the scripts we wrote together, and some of them obviously got tossed out and started again, into a book, it would have been an easy 450, 500 page novel. No doubt.
Because that's why I found astounding. There's just so much. There's so much to tell. There's so much evidence. There's so many tapes, and that Ken Klonsky, is that right? When the tapes come, and that is the kind of the catalyst, I guess, for it with the story, that you've got this whole thing that you can now uncover. There's just so much. So to make those decisions, did you at times have to be? I find that difficult, to be ruthless, but also to be fair.
I think there's a couple of things to that. The first thing is that there's lots of information that we received, that we got about the story, that just isn't in the story, that isn't in our telling of it. And that is because the primary decision that we came to was only facts that we can corroborate, so no conjecture, some people think this, but actually there's no basis for it. So absolutely everything you hear has some evidence behind it.
No talking heads.
That talking heads.
Distinct policy.
Primary sources, only people who were there, not people who've studied it or things like that. Only the people who were there in their own words. And actually, when you get to that point, it becomes a little bit easier, because you can say, well, I know X thinks that, but he's got no basis for that. That's just going to confuse the story more. Out it goes. Okay. I think actually that was quite a liberating part of the process, because we did have discussions quite often about elements and bits of the story and names and people as the investigation goes on, like people who are named by other people. But if we couldn't get anything on it, there was no benefit in us saying, and we've also found because we can't add anything to it, we can't corroborate.
Right. And you set a ridiculously high bar, basically. That's how we were ruthless.
And that's why I'm here talking to you now, because I was just like, this is a lot of work. This is a higher level than things I'd listened to before, and it was great. But it also, I think, it was very. It felt comfortable, and it felt at times, like I was saying, a bit raw at times, and I liked that. Yeah, I thought that was good. Yeah. I want to talk about some of the characters involved and how that has affected your thoughts on things a little bit. And do you feel like the whole thing has affected your thoughts on different subjects?
Beyond the tapes, like in general life and how I view people. I think it's difficult not to. I mean, it's study in people's reaction to an event.
Yes.
And what they think and how time changes their perception. So I think it would be difficult not to go through that process.
So that leads me on perfectly, because one thing for me, I think that the evolution of racism in that period of time in America But even, to this day, we're still, all these things are still going on, and it's still evolving. But I found it interesting that the first case is obviously 1967, the second case is 1975. 76, sorry. But you can almost feel sort of the clouds of racism like going away a tiny bit. Society evolving in terms of their racism. What did you learn about racism in America in the 60s and 70s? What were you surprised by? Is there anything you were surprised by?
I think that the cloud of racism covered the entire period, and whilst it might have been ever slightly less of a shade 10 years after the first trial, it's still amazingly strong. I kept going back to the original, my original point that we were talking about when we were doing the first episode. So the first episode, we introduced Rubin as a character, as a man, his upbringing. Now, he was born in 1937. He had a relationship with his grandfather. His grandfather was still alive when Rubin was born, and I think didn't die until he was 6 or 7. His grandfather was alive during the slavery era, okay? And that is, as a white man from the UK, something very difficult to get my head around, that Rubin Carter had a relationship with someone in his family who was a slave. I mean, it still sends a shiver down my back. That permeates. Yeah. That is the starting point of understanding the racism in this story, I think.
I think that the frame. This is where sort of framing comes into it. If it wasn't for the fact that it isn't such a horrifically evident issue in America today, this probably wouldn't be a podcast, because again, I think it's the fact that, we were kind of hoping people listen to this and without needing to be told, people think, Christ, it's not got any better. In fact, some people would say, and some people have, Johnny Carter, Rubin's cousin, says to in episode 1, it's damn near the same, if not worse, today. And the framing thing is important to us, I think, because if it weren't for having the tapes, we wouldn't hear Rubin Carter talking about his own childhood in a very racist America. And we are two middle-class white blokes. Like, we have no right... We have no right to tell that story without Rubin Carter's voice, I think. So again, that's another thing that turned this from potentially being a standalone documentary into being a podcast, that we had that extra voice that we could tell. And the other thing is, we met at least one racist during this, and that is a thing. I've never spoken to anybody before who clearly has a problem with, in this case, black people, and doing that, speaking to someone who was of that time, it does bring it home when you actually meet somebody who clearly has those views or had those views. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
It's
particularly when they're in a position of power.
Well, that kind of goes back to what I'm saying about that being affected by stuff, because I think that's an amazing position that we're in, that we can go and look into stories that can change the way you're thinking about things. That's the whole point of this series for me, is to get a chance to come up and talk to you guys and understand that. Because another thing I wanted to ask, because it entered my mind as a white middle class guy as well. Were you nervous about being the guys who told the story, considering that you're white?
Yeah.
Oh yeah, absolutely. I mean, the truth. There's a few things to say about that. The first is that it wasn't that the BBC came up with this idea and they looked for 2 producers and they picked two middle-class white guys.
You've seen the lineup.
Yeah, exactly.
Who's 2 white guys?
Those two there. Yeah. So so it was an idea that we went forward at, but it does identify, highlight the lack of diversity within the media industry. Yep. Because obviously if there were more people from other ethnic backgrounds, the chances are that they would have the same ideas and they would get them commissioned. Yes. So we are conscious of that. We were desperately trying to understand as much as we could, never take anything for granted, challenge ourselves, challenge our kind of the subconscious bias that
yes.
I guess we all have.
Yes.
And tell this and let the people who are in this story tell the story. That's why.
Well, that's it. I was nervous when I thought, this is a story that we're telling, and how do we do it justice when we're not from that time? but I was not nervous as soon as I realised that actually we're not telling this story.
Yeah.
They're telling.
Because there was moments I was
Rubin
like,
is telling his own story.
Yeah. There were moments where I was like, "Come on, Steve, what do you think? What do you think?" But you didn't, which I think is a smart thing to do.
Because the story's not about us. That was the other thing
Yes,
we were
of
really,
course.
really keen to do. That, and this, I'm not having to go. I am about to have a go at other podcasts, but I'm not going to name any. But you sometimes listen to podcasts and there's two things that often strike me. The first is that it suddenly becomes about the person who's telling the story. Well, I don't really care about the person telling the story.
Unless they are directly...
unless it's...
you know what I mean?
But
unless it's their story.
Yeah, exactly. Because that implies to me that the story you were covering in the first place isn't that strong if you've got to tell me about your story, unless it directly relates. And the second thing is that there's no flab. So there's not like, we tried to get hold of Dave and the phone just rang and no one answered. And we tried 3 days later and we got no... There's none of that. We're just like...
We only tell you stuff if we got it.
That's it. And there's none of this the chase, because believe me, the process of getting hold of some of the people who we did get hold of took a long time. But that's about us. The people aren't interested, I don't think, or they shouldn't be interested when the story is so strong itself.
Give me a brief version of that process of trying to get those people then.
Well, I think overall I probably got 90% of the pro-Rubin people, and Joel probably got, well, actually maybe even 100% of the anti-Rubin people. And actually so the pro-Rubin people were quite easy, to be honest, because somebody like John Artis isn't that difficult to find. And once you find a couple of people, you end up finding more, because at the start we thought we were doing this very pro-Rubin Carter story and everybody was very keen to get on board with that. The negative ones are harder, mainly because they all feel that their side of the story has never been told, which is true, and, you know, with some of them there's probably a good reason for that, and for some of them we thought, you know, they definitely deserve their chance to tell it. You did a lot more of the work than I did, but it was basically a domino effect, wasn't it? It was once you got one negative Carter person and once they were happy with the treatment they got from us, then they would give us somebody else.
Yeah, it's about building relationships and explaining to people and convincing them through your actions that you are genuinely giving them a platform to tell their story, and that you aren't giving opinion. You are allowing them to have their say. Now, some of those people, in my opinion, which I'm not giving, but some of the people, when you listen to them, you think, well, that's clearly racist. but you know, that's for them. That's them in their own words. Yeah. But so the process was difficult. It is about relationship building. It does take a long time, and there are bumps in the road. It's like anything, but eventually. And I think also the big benefit of being able to see someone face to face. Like, emails are great, phone calls are great, but when you actually get to meet someone, you get a measure of the person that you're dealing with, and thankfully.
And that process got us maybe either the most important or second most important find of this whole thing, which is the son of the lead detective. And this is a lead detective who'd been painted as as basically being the Antichrist. In fact, he was described as being the runner-up to the Antichrist by one of the interviewees in the podcast. His son spoke to us when he'd never spoke to anybody before, and it was because, you know, Joel was able to give him assurances that he would be, you know, handled properly and given his say and treated fairly. That's the way to put it. And he gave us a box of his father's old files, which included so many little things which we could then expect, like, you know, a tape of his dad literally sitting down in front of a microphone in the 70s and saying, "This is Lieutenant Vincent D. Simone. This is the story of this case as I see it. What I say from this moment on is off the record."
Because there's no audio of him. He does. I mean, it was a time before YouTube.
Yeah.
Who'd have thought there was a time before YouTube? But and you know, that's a really good point. I can see it very clearly. We were in a breakfast restaurant in New Jersey, and we'd agreed to meet for breakfast, just to chat. Just, you know, we're not going to record anything. And I remember at the end of it, he looked up and he said, "You know what? I like you two guys." We were like, "Yeah, of course you do. You're only human." And he said, I've got a box of stuff. When my dad left the police force, or when he died, they gave me all his private files. I don't suppose you'd be interested in that, would you?" We were like, "Oh, wow, yes,
probably interested in that."
Yes, we could be convinced. So,
but this is actually another example of how high we sort of set the bar for, not just to do with people, but to do with information. Is that Jim D. Simone, this guy who's the son of the lead detective, told us he believed it was possible that he had one of the guns used in the murders in his basement.
She flippantly told you that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And we spent quite a lot of time thinking about, do we try and sort of go and see this or whatever? But, you know, through a longer process, we decided there is no way of this. There's no way this is correct. And we spoke to a few people, and it just became clear that it wasn't the case. So we didn't include it because we thought, well, what's the point of having a part of our thing which is, and he says he might have one of the guns, and then we looked into it. Oh, he didn't.
Yeah.
What, was there moments during those conversations where you're one side of the desk and you just go, you just put your hand on each other's knee or something like that? We've got some.
Not quite that.
Yeah,
not
not after the restraining order, but yeah. No, there were lots of times during that we'd have an interview.
With
and
the eyes.
I'd catch it and be like, oh my god, I can't believe they said that. Again, we turned up to a meeting with one of the guests, and we knew a piece of information that we hadn't had corroborated about the relationship between one of the people in the series and the police. And before we'd even sat down, annoyingly before we'd even turned on the recording devices, we got talking with the person, and they confirmed something that was quite remarkable about the relationship that the police had with someone in the series. And that was quite a moment. And we both were like, we didn't even have to ask a question. He just offered the information
and the name of that person.
And they're still alive, so I might refrain from saying that.
The classic example, I suppose, is in the very first episode. There is a moment when we're speaking to Rubin's cousin, and he says this was the biggest eye-opening moment of the whole thing when we were recording this interview, and this is pretty much the only interview we didn't do in person, or one of the very few. So we got introduced to Rubin's cousin, and this is when we'd come back from the first of about 4 trips in the end to America to make this thing. And he was like, yeah, and of course, you know, the guy who did it, we only found out that years later. And we were like, what? Who is the guy who did it?
That's in there, isn't it?
That's right.
You can hear that, and you always go, no, who is it?
Yeah. And again, without giving anything away, we tried very hard throughout the series going forward, and we did eventually meet up with him in person to see if we could collate enough information and show him that we had found enough to convince him that it was okay to reveal who that person was, and whether or not that happens, you can
have to listen to it. Yeah, let's talk about DeSimone, the investigator, who was very, very certain that Rubin Carter and John Artis had done this.
Yeah, eventually,
yes. From a broader point of view, I wanted to know what your thoughts are on that certainty in investigations, and also maybe is it Patty Valentine?
Yeah, the witness,
the big eyewitness. Both those two things, I think, normally a lot of people. Well, I guess it depends where you come from and your upbringing and all those things. But some people go, "Oh, police are good. Police are always doing the right things." Or if someone said they saw it, then they saw it. What are your views on all of that kind of stuff? That the power of a witness and the certainty of a
it's
of a
so
witness.
Small, isn't it? Like one of the things we learned is how unreliable eyewitness testimonies really are.
It's the very worst form of evidence that there can be, and this is a case, remember, that has no real forensic evidence. It has it's crying out for a bit of evidence that you can touch and hold, and there isn't, and all there really is what people saw, and it is just so unreliable, and not maliciously, not because people want to give false information, just because it's a stressful situation.
Yes.
You know, and the mind does things to protect you in stressful situations, and then time passes, and sometimes after a week you misremember things, after a year you misremember things, and it was very frustrating because this case relies so heavily on what people say they saw. And I think the interesting thing is that I think by and large everyone who says what they saw believes that is what they saw.
Yeah.
Even though that, if you took all of them, that can't possibly be true, because they all counter.
The way I looked at it, I think people, you need evidence, so people end up going, well, your eyes are like a camera. but actually there's so much agenda
Right.
in your mind
Yeah.
that, and so many things conflicting with it, and then, like you say, that film fades as well. That really took me by surprise. I mean, I've probably had those thoughts otherwise, but really, that eyewitnesses aren't great witnesses.
No, not at all. They're really not. And again, part of the reason there wasn't any forensic evidence is because this really occurred before proper forensics existed.
DNA.
It was stuff like, paraffin tests were what they used to see if you had gunshot residue on your hands. This is one of the key things of this case. They didn't do that. So Rubin Carter and John Artis are there in police custody, and they didn't give them this test. They did give them lie detector tests, and again, even the results of those are disputed.
Yeah. This is the podcast.
Yes, it's all in the pod.
Let's talk about Bob Dylan and his impact in this.
Bob, yeah.
Because I found that really interesting as well, that you just think, I was always a bit angry at the fact that if a celebrity, you've seen it very really recently with Donald Trump and ASAP Rocky. ASAP Rocky's in Sweden, and so because it's ASAP Rocky, that means Donald Trump gets involved. I mean, Donald Trump gets involved in everything, but anyway. Or things with like Kim Kardashian lends her influence to something. But that same thing was happening back in the 70s with Bob Dylan and Muhammad Ali and so many people. But what I found interesting was that media attention is only helpful to a point, isn't it? It can actually be detrimental as well.
I think the first thing to say is I don't think Trump would be jumping to Rubin Carter's defence.
No, I think that's fair.
I
don't think him and Bob Dylan got that much.
Well, no, quite, and certainly not Rubin Carter. Yeah, I mean, no, it's an interesting point because we met several people on both sides who came to the conclusion that like cause célèbre element of the second trial ended up actually being more detrimental than helpful. Whilst it of course brought attention to the case, it's not always the right attention. Because Selwyn Rabb said that, didn't they? The New York journalist who covered it at the time, who was I would say on Carter's side, but came to the conclusion that Carter was completely innocent, and he told us that actually all that media circus contributed really to the conviction, the second conviction. Because
any juror on this case would have been totally aware of everything that's going on. So suddenly your own personal feelings about people like Muhammad Ali come to the fore. And actually, one of the things that Rubin says on the tapes that he was told in the build-up to him being freed the first time is you don't have enough black people sort of on your side. So they went on basically a quest to enlist the help of black celebrities, which is something that they eventually managed to achieve. But again, when you talk about things like unconscious bias, there will have been a lot of people who learned about this case only through that media campaign. So it isn't always, it's a double-edged sword. You need attention, but also if you're living in a community which has a lot of racism in it, you're still, when you're then thrust into the spotlight, anything that happens can also impact negatively on you.
And it puts such a spotlight on your character. Obviously, years later, you've got the O.J. Simpson trial, and his the caricature that he'd created, that kind of helped him out in the end of it. Whereas with Rubin Carter, like you said, that he actually, as a boxer, he portrayed that sort of nasty image, which actually then, once you've got that spotlight, that probably gets it out into people's minds more and more, I would imagine.
And to be fair, that's obviously wrong. That shouldn't happen, clearly. But Rubin Carter would say exactly what you've just said, because he says it on the tapes. He basically says, in fact, not basically, he does say, I was as much to blame for being convicted of these murders as any, potentially corrupt police officer, because of the way he painted himself. And his daughter said that to us as well. Theodora Carter said exactly the same thing.
The authorities were able to use the image that he'd cultivated to convince an already unsure and unsettled white community in a changing racial era that this man was a bad person and should be off the streets. And my last point about Dylan is that the authorities could use that as an us against them. So here they portrayed Dylan and all the other stars that came forward for him as the liberal elite, the Hollywood liberal elite, here to want to change, to tell small town America, small white town America, that you're bad people. And so, again, as I say, the authorities were able to say to the jury, this small select group of people from this relatively small part of New Jersey, you know, don't be swayed by this liberal elite. We know what's right and we know what's wrong.
Yeah, I think that's kind of what I was trying to get at, is they went from being the underdogs, if you like, to the opposite of that. Suddenly the prosecution were the underdogs who were sort of fighting against this media machine. So actually, in terms of the way the whole thing was framed, the prosecution were able to flip that on its head.
Yeah.
So obviously there's a lot of dark moments in making this the story itself. I think it's always important to try and look at some of the good bits that you can find from it as well. There's some, for me, one is the values and the strength of John Artis is one. And then another character who, again, if you listen to it or look at the story, Lesra, and the impact that he makes on their lives of two people that are in prison and it looks like they've got no hope at all. Those two things for me I thought were absolutely incredible and aspiring and positive in something that's so dark. What were the sort of nice bits that you were able to take from this project?
I mean, there were lots of great bits. I mean, the tapes are 40 hours long, and Rubin is a hilarious character in a good way. I don't mean like not a clown.
Yeah,
he's a very funny man, and so you can listen through and anecdotes, and so there was lots of fun there. John, John is the star for me because he has been through so much, and he has a fabulous laugh. And he's just such a nice person. I mean, that sounds a terrible thing to, not damning people with fake praise.
Yeah.
He's just good company, engaging.
But he shouldn't be a nice person, should he?
If that was me, I remember saying to him, we had dinner after the interview, I remember saying, if that was me, I'd be bitter, I'd be angry at the world.
You'd never recover.
I wouldn't. There's no way. I'd spend the whole of my life resenting everything. And, if everything just rolls off his back.
The other side of that, which just tells you what a guy he is that, and it's probably an indication that we did a fairly decent job on this series, is that not everybody we spoke to during the series is very happy with the series, because there are a lot of, lots of pro-Rubin people are furious that we have even cast any aspersion on the possibility that he could have been involved. Like, even if you come to the conclusion as a listener that he wasn't, they're still not happy that it was even on the table.
Yes.
John's fine, and it's John's life. There are these other people who, some of them were close friends of Rubin who are fuming. John's fine. Yeah. I speak to John. WhatsApped to me last night. I speak to John minimum 2 or 3 times a month. We get on absolutely brilliantly. He is a lovely human, but he knows, and we had to ask him, difficult questions at times. We didn't outwardly say to him, "Were you there? Did you do it?" Because you don't need to, because those answers come out from your discussion. Yeah. But just to tell you 2 very quick stories from the tapes, which just made me howl with laughter. And again, sometimes with Rubin, you don't necessarily know if he's trying to be funny. But the first one was, and they're both in the series. The first one is when he talks about his being in prison, and he says, you're in the interrogation room, and there's no natural light in the room, and they take away all semblance of what day it is and what time it is. And then he starts talking about like the interrogation of potential terrorist suspects, and how he says, this all comes from America in the 1960s, and how they were just shut down and you wouldn't know where you were or when you were. Anyway, thankfully I had a watch on. Right? Yeah. And then he tells another story where he's talking about his daughter coming to see him in prison, and it's a really earnest story. And again, his daughter's a wonderful human, and interviewing her was amazing. But he says about that, he was like, she came to see me in prison and she said, "Daddy, why can't you come home?" And so I wrote her this poem, and I called the poem Freedom. And the poem is all about catching a bird, but not being able to keep the bird as a pet because it should be free. And he tells this poem, he reads the poem, and he says, I don't know if she understood, but I certainly felt better. And you're just like, the self-obsession of this guy.
Yeah.
And that's actually a phrase that got us in a little bit of hot water with his friends, is describing Rubin Carter as self-obsessed. But he was.
Yeah.
He was and
As are many boxers.
that doesn't make him a murderer.
No,
He
exactly.
was very self-obsessed.
I think I just had a couple of things that made me laugh. So, again, one from the tapes. He's in conversation with the guy who recorded the tapes, did the book, and he's talking about his life before the first arrest, and about how life evolved, and that youngsters go out and they get in trouble and they get into fights and they get drunk, and the interviewer says, "But you never did that, did you?" And Rubin just goes, "Yeah, sure I did. Of course I did." And you're like, okay, it's funny. He actually was a very interesting man. I'm not sure I believed everything that came out of his mouth, but he was a very entertaining and thoughtful person. And the only other thing is that we met a guy called Fred Hogan, who's a very important part of the story. Lovely man, great man. Again, still in touch with us. I'm going out to New York soon. I'd be delighted to meet up with him. Again, one of the people who's not upset, even though we didn't always say the nicest things, or we implied that there were counter stories. Yeah, anyway, we get to his place in New Jersey, and he's very welcoming. He's putting a spread for us, and got sandwiches and biscuits and fizzy drinks, and he says, well, first I'll show you my little, like, Rubin's corner, and he's got like a little homage to Rubin, and he's got like, I don't know, like a signed photo and one of his boxing gloves, and then there's something there's a small round thing that's just lying on the mantelpiece, and he picks it up and he says, "You know what this is?" And it was like one of those moments where we looked at each other like,
no, surely not.
No, please tell. And he has. So Rubin Carter had a false eye from a fight that he got in prison, and bad operation anyway. And Fred was given Rubin's eye when Rubin passed on, and not only does he own the eye, which in itself is a little bit weird.
Is enough.
Is it? Yeah, quite. Not only that he owns it, that he has it on display, but then he goes on to tell us that he can wear it as a pendant. And that if we really like, and before we even had a chance to say no, we don't like, he's getting the necklace out and he's wearing it round his neck for the rest of the interview. So that kind of
he's got the
He's got the eye of the
hurricane. He's got the eye of the hurricane. Yeah. Keep an eye on you.
Shows the power of the pun and how that can you'll go to any lengths to manifest it. Very final thing, because we've got to go. For anyone wanting to take on a big story, what advice would you give them in any medium?
I mean, I think probably the biggest piece of advice that I would give them is something that I talked about earlier, which is go with the story. Don't stick with what you've got. Don't think, but actually this is the piece I'm making. Wherever it takes you, go with it. And the reality is, if it's taking you in a different direction than the direction you thought you were going in, then you pretty much know you've got something brand new there. I think that would be number one.
I think that is a very good piece of advice. And the other thing, I guess, again, that we touched on is no one knows what ends up on the cutting room floor, and be brave enough to take out anything that comes close to making it anything other than as lean and as slick as you can make it. And sometimes you have to, it's really good to work with someone else, because you might think, I have to have that bit in, and they'll say, no, we don't need it.
Yeah, you can get too close, can't you?
Oh, definitely, yeah.
Amazing advice. Thank you for sharing your time.
No worries.
Right, guys, first things first, I mean, look, this is on my channel, so subscribe to my channel first, okay? Then after you've done that, go on to iTunes and follow 2 podcasts. This one, The Process, but most importantly, actually, The Hurricane Tapes. It is fantastic. It's a joy to chat to you guys.
Cheers.
Thank you so much. Unfortunately, I don't think there'll be a sequel. Will there?
Wow.
Oh my God,
You might be surprised.
Really?
Yeah. There isn't going to be a second series.
But there'll be something.
But there
Christmas special.
is going to be around January, to mark a year since the series started. We will be making a special programme.
Amazing.
Yeah. Might come out in January, but
yeah, we'll see.
Yeah.
Oh wow. Okay, well, so go listen to it, and then you can enjoy the special when it comes out. Guys, thanks so much.
Thank you.